The sky above the last human colony was a sickly shade of red, the sun a distant fading ember swallowed by a thick blanket of dust. The wind, a constant howling presence, carried the faint scent of something unfamiliar, perhaps the very earth itself, rebelling against humanity's presence. The colony was a jagged scar on an alien landscape, a last testament to the audacity of mankind. Captain Kara Easton stood at the edge of the colony's perimeter, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the storm clouds churned ominously. Behind her, the remnants of the colony sprawled in a haphazard array of makeshift structures and tech salvaged from the ashes of Earth. The planet they had called home was no longer hospitable. The once great cities of Earth now reduced to memories and charred skeletons. The survivors had found refuge here, but refuge was a fragile thing. This planet, known only as Asharian, was not Earth, nor was it kind. It was an unforgiving world, a place of relentless storms and ever-present danger. But for the last few years, it had been their sanctuary, or so Kara had believed. She knew what they were up against. The Hivarians, an ancient and cruel race, had warned them. Their fleet had hovered silently in orbit, watching with disdain as humanity clung to life. But the attacks had always been distant, indirect, and the threat had felt like nothing more than a shadow in the distance. Until now, her hand rested lightly on the hilt of her weapon as she turned away from the horizon and strode toward the makeshift command center. Inside, her officers stood over holographic displays, analyzing data that only deepened the pit in her stomach. There was no mistaking the evidence. The Hivarians were coming for them, and they weren't coming to negotiate. The officer standing at the console, Lieutenant Markov, turned sharply as she entered. His face was drawn, pale from sleepless nights spent staring at the tactical readouts that had become their lives. His eyes were wide with a mix of fear and determination. "They've broken through the outer systems, Kara," Markov said, his voice hoarse but steady. "They're heading directly for us. They won't stop until the colony is nothing more than dust." Kara's jaw tightened. She'd been expecting this moment, but now that it was here, it felt more like a nightmare than reality. The Hivarians had once been allies, distant, uncaring ones, but allies nonetheless. That was before the human presence on Asharion had begun to grow. "We can't win this," Markov continued, his gaze unwavering. "Not with what we have. We need to consider a full retreat, leave the colony and run. There are other outposts in the sector. We can find refuge." "No." Kara's voice was cold, final. "This colony is all we have left. If we abandon it, humanity dies here, and the Hivarians know it. They won't stop until they've exterminated us completely." She knew the truth of it. Earth was gone. There would be no refuge, no place to run. The fate of mankind rested on the people here on Asharion, and Kara would be damned before she let that die. "Prepare the defenses," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil swirling in her chest. "We fight." But Markov was shaking his head, the tension in the room palpable. "And what if we lose? What if they wipe us out, Kara? What then?" Kara met his gaze, her own eyes hardening. "Then we fight anyway. The colony's defensive." Grid hummed to life, the weapons and shields flickering in place as the warning sirens blared. Kara turned away from Markov, her gaze sweeping across the walls of the command center, the faces of the officers who had placed their trust in her. They were all terrified. They had every right to be, but they were still here, standing tall. She had lost her family on Earth. She had seen her home reduced to a wasteland. But she would not let Asharion fall. She would not let humanity's last stand be erased, not without a fight. As she began issuing orders, her thoughts drifted back to Earth, back to those who had perished in the flames of war, to the generations who had known nothing but hardship. Kara could almost hear the cries of her people echoing in the wind. They had been resilient then, and they would be resilient now. "Are we ready?" she asked, her voice calm, betraying none of the doubt that lurked beneath the surface. "Lieutenant." Markov hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Ready as we'll ever be." Kara turned back toward the horizon, the red skies now darkened by the encroaching fleet. She could see their ships, glinting like predatory beasts in the distance. They were here, and this time they weren't just here to warn. They were here to finish what they had started. The storm was coming, and it wasn't just a storm of nature. It was a storm of fire, of blood, of survival. Kara's grip on her weapon tightened. She would make sure humanity's name lived on. Whatever the cost, the distant rumble of the incoming fleet reverberated through the ground beneath her feet, like the distant rumble of the incoming fleet reverberated through the ground beneath her feet like the drumbeats of an unstoppable force. Asharian would be their final battlefield, but Kara would make sure it was named after their massacre, not theirs. The war for humanity's survival was about to begin, and for Kara there would be no retreat. The sirens blared, a shrill, piercing sound that echoed through the metal walls of the colony. Kara stood in the command center, her eyes locked on the holographic map that displayed the exact trajectory of the Hivarian fleet. It was closing in with unnerving precision, its course unaltered despite all efforts to outmaneuver it. She could feel the pulse of the ship beneath her boots, the air thick with tension, as officers scrambled to maintain the last semblance of control. "Distance?" Kara asked, her voice sharp and steady, though the weight of the moment pressed down on her chest like a crushing hand. 10 minutes until they breach the atmosphere," Markov reported, his voice betraying none of the fear that was swelling in his chest. "We're not prepared for this. We're looking at a total wipeout unless we can pull something off." Kara clenched, her fists, the rough leather of her gloves creaking in the silence. It was exactly what she feared. The Hivarians were too powerful, too numerous. They had been slowly pushing human colonies to the brink for years, but none had resisted like this one, and now the cost of that defiance was about to be paid. "Lock down the defense systems," she ordered, though she knew it would do little. Their weapons were designed to repel raiders, not a full-scale assault from an enemy fleet capable of turning planets to ash with a single strike. The colony's shields flickered as they powered up, but the energy reserves were already near. "Their breaking point. Are we ready for evacuation?" Kara asked, her eyes scanning the faces around her. They had drilled for this moment, but drills were nothing compared to the reality of the situation. Markov didn't need to answer her. His haunted gaze said everything. "We don't have time." The heavy doors to the command center swung open with a groan, and Kara's mind snapped back to the present. A young officer stepped in, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. He handed Kara a data pad, and her eyes moved swiftly over the information. "Colonel, we just received a transmission from the Hivarian fleet," the officer stammered. "They're broadcasting a message directly to us." Kara narrowed her eyes. A message? That was rare. Usually the Hivarians didn't bother with theatrics. They just destroyed. But there was something unnerving about this. "Put it through," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The screen flickered before a distorted image appeared. The face of a Hivarian commander, his angular features and pale, almost translucent skin twisted into an expression that could almost be called amusement. "You are the last of your kind," the alien said, his voice rich with disdain. "We have allowed you to linger, thinking you could survive. But now you will fall. The galaxy will be rid of your infestation." Kara's blood ran cold. She'd heard stories of the Hivarians' cruelty, but hearing it firsthand was different. These weren't just words. These were the words of a conqueror who had seen humanity's rise and was determined to snuff it out once and for all. The Hivarian's mouth twisted into a smile, though there was nothing warm about it. "Prepare to face your extinction, Captain. Easton, you will die here, and your colony will become a monument to your failure." The transmission cut out, and Kara stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the alien's words sinking into her bones. Markov's voice broke through the tension. "They're not leaving us any chance. They're coming to finish the job." Kara's mind raced. If they couldn't repel the fleet, if they couldn't find a way to stop the Hivarians, humanity was finished. She turned to Markov, her voice low but resolute. "We won't give them the satisfaction. They want a monument? Let's give them one." As she issued her orders, the chaos around her intensified. Officers scrambled to their stations, scrambling, to prepare whatever defenses they could, while others began organizing the final evacuation. It was all happening too fast. Kara could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but there was no time for fear, no room for hesitation. The colony's outer defenses were weak, and they knew it. It was built to withstand minor skirmishes, not an all-out war with an enemy of such overwhelming power. But that didn't matter now. There was only one goal: survival, for as long as possible. Kara's gaze shifted to the blueprints of the colony displayed before her. There was one final defense she could use, one that could buy them time, but at a cost. It was risky, untested, and could very well be their undoing, but it was all they had left. "Get the experimental weapon ready," she said firmly. "We don't have time to waste." "Captain, that's a last resort weapon," Markov protested. "We can't be sure it will work. We use it or we die," Kara interrupted, her voice cutting through his protests. "Make it work, or we're all dead anyway." The room fell silent as Markov reluctantly nodded and moved to relay her orders. Kara could feel the weight of her decision pressing on her shoulders. They were taking a gamble, a dangerous one. But the alternative was far worse. Outside, the first volley of enemy fire lit up the sky. The battle had begun. Kara's stomach churned as the impact reverberated through the walls. The colony shuddered, and the harsh, shrill cry of the alarms blared. Again, the first wave of enemy ships had breached the atmosphere. "We don't have long," Markov said, his voice taut with anxiety. "The weapon's ready, but it's going to take a lot of power to activate it. It's going to drain the colony's last reserves." "I know," Kara said, her gaze steely. "Make it work." As the enemy ships descended, the full scale of their assault became clear. The sky was filled with darkness as the fleet broke through the clouds. The colony's defensive shields flared to life, glowing bright against the looming shadow of the Hivarian ships. But Kara knew it was a fleeting defense. "We need to get to the generator," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "It's our only hope." The team raced to the central power core, their every step measured and deliberate as the tension mounted with each passing second. Kara's mind whirred with calculations. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. Every decision now was life or death. And then, as the last wave of enemy ships began to position themselves above the colony, she knew what she had to do. "Activate it," she ordered. A hum filled the air, low and ominous, as the power surged. The weapon, still untested, began to pulse with violent energy. The ground beneath them trembled as the colony's last hope gathered its strength. The countdown to destruction had begun, and the only thing that stood between humanity's extinction and survival was their ability to unleash the full fury of their last weapon before the Hivarians could crush them all. The world trembled beneath Kara Easton's feet, the walls of the colony groaning in protest as the Hivarian fleet loomed ever closer. The central power core hummed with an ominous energy. The last experimental weapon they had was now their sole hope. But Kara knew better than anyone that hope was often a fragile thing in war. "Is it ready?" Kara's voice cut through the chaos of the command center, her hands gripping the railing as she stared at the holographic display. The incoming alien ships were already overwhelming the defensive shields, their numbers seemingly endless. Markov, face drawn with exhaustion, turned to her. "We're going to drain every last ounce of power, Captain. If this doesn't work, it has to work," she interrupted, her voice steady, but with an edge of desperation. "There's no other choice." The weapon, an ancient alien relic they had unearthed months ago beneath the colony's surface, was designed to unleash a devastating pulse of energy capable of leveling anything in its path. But it came with one massive caveat. It was unstable. Its full power had never been tested. No one knew if it would destroy them all, or if it would be the weapon they needed to turn the tide against the Hivarians. The countdown clock flashed on the screen, its harsh red glow a constant reminder of their dwindling time. There was no turning back now. Kara had given the order. Now she had to see it through. "We need to hold them off for as long as possible," she said, turning to Markov. "Get the last reserve power to the core. I'll keep the Hivarians distracted." Markov hesitated, but only for a moment. He knew what she was asking. "You're not—" "I'll be fine," Kara said. "Just make sure that weapon fires." Without waiting for a response, Kara moved swiftly toward the doors of the command center. The soldiers, pale-faced and weary, stood ready for the inevitable. Their faces were a reflection of her own feelings, fear, but also determination. They were prepared to face their end with honor, even if it meant certain death. As Kara moved through the corridors, the reality of what was happening began to set in. The colony, their home, was on the brink of total destruction. Every inch of the metal walls felt like it was closing in on her, and the weight of responsibility seemed unbearable. She had failed to protect the people she loved. She had failed to shield them from the inevitable destruction that had always seemed so distant, so unreal. Now it was real. Outside, the skies were a riot of flashing lights, the explosions of incoming Hivarian weaponry lighting up the atmosphere. Kara could hear the distant rumble of the first impacts. The colony's shields were beginning to fail, flickering under the intensity of the alien barrage. But she had no time to think about that. There was only one task left: distract the Hivarians long enough for Markov and the team to finish powering the weapon. She entered the hangar, where the last few working fighters were being prepped for combat. The techs were moving quickly, their hands shaking as they worked, trying to make the machines fly for one last, desperate stand. "Get me a ship," Kara commanded, her voice cutting through the noise of the hangar. One of the techs, a young woman, with short-cropped hair and wide, terrified eyes, glanced up. "You can't be serious. We need every pilot in the air." "Now, Sergeant," Kara snapped. "This is not a request." The tech hesitated, but only for a moment. She nodded quickly and gestured to a fighter that had been abandoned for repairs. Kara wasted no time climbing into the cockpit, her mind racing as she scanned the instruments, each one now ticking toward a final countdown. The familiar hum of the engine filled her ears as she powered it up. The ship shuddered, reluctant at first, but then roaring to life. She locked the weapon systems and hit the throttle, launching herself into the atmosphere just as another barrage of Hivarian fire exploded in the distance. The feeling of acceleration was a rush she hadn't experienced in months, but it felt wrong, unnatural, like a final, desperate gasp. Up above, the alien ships moved with horrifying precision. The Hivarian ships were colossal, their sleek designs exuding an air of arrogance, of certainty. They were gods of war, and humanity a mere nuisance. Kara gritted her teeth, fighting back the rising tide of panic. Her orders were clear. Stall. To them. Do whatever it took to buy Markov and the team enough time to activate the weapon. She came into range of the lead Hivarian vessel, her ship shaking violently under the assault of enemy fire. She weaved and dodged, her mind focused, each movement instinctual. But the Hivarians weren't fooled. They saw her, they tracked her, and within moments their countermeasures began to rain down on her like a swarm of locusts. The cockpit was filled with the sound of alarms as her ship took a hit, the shields flickering before they collapsed entirely. The fighter spun out of control for a brief moment, but Kara gritted her teeth and fought the controls back into position. She locked onto her target, firing a barrage of missiles at the nearest Hivarian cruiser. But the alien ship's defenses were too powerful. The missiles exploded in a useless, fiery display as the ship's shields absorbed the impact. Kara's heart raced as she pushed the throttle to its limit, dodging another wave of fire. Her comms crackled to life. "Captain," Markov's voice came through, distant but clear. "We're powering up the weapon, but it's taking longer than expected. You need to keep them distracted for just a few more minutes." Minutes. Kara's heart pounded as she looped around, drawing the attention of the nearest enemy craft. She was buying time, nothing more. The weapon was their only hope. She pushed the ship forward, determined to cause as much damage as she could, hoping, against hope, that the enemy wouldn't notice the true threat hidden beneath the surface. The Hivarians had no idea that the weapon wasn't just their last resort. It was their salvation. The ship bucked and jolted again, another hit from the Hivarian fleet slamming into the hull. She felt a sharp sting in her shoulder as the impact threw her sideways, but she didn't let go of the controls. Not now, not when they were this close. "Hold the line!" Kara shouted into the comms, even though she knew no one could hear her. She wasn't just holding the line for the colony. She was holding the line for humanity itself. But as the ship spun into another evasive maneuver, a crushing realization hit her. Even if she managed to keep them distracted, even if she gave Markov and the others the time they needed, the cost of victory might be more than humanity could bear. The weapon, the only thing left to stop the Hivarians, could kill them all, and it was about to be unleashed. The battle raged above Asharian, a brutal dance of fire and fury, each blast of alien weaponry, sending tremors through the ground below. Kara Easton's fighter screamed through the air, battered but determined, the hull groaning under the strain of constant hits. Her heart pounded in sync with the explosions that reverberated through the cockpit, a deafening reminder of the stakes. "Keep them off our backs!" Markov's voice crackled through the comms, his words distorted by static, but the urgency in them was clear. "Weapon is almost ready. We need more time." Kara's grip tightened on the controls. The colony's defenses were faltering, shields failing with every passing second. There was no room for error. The experimental weapon, humanity's last hope, was their only chance, but it was far from a guaranteed success. If it failed, if they couldn't trigger it in time, the Hivarians would sweep through the colony like a tidal wave, eradicating what little remained of humanity. Ahead of her, the Hivarian fleet loomed, a dark, imposing force that seemed to swallow the sky. Their ships, sleek and monstrous, hovered just above Asharian's surface, releasing deadly blasts of energy that seared through the colony's makeshift defenses. Kara could feel the heat from the explosions even at this altitude. The alien ships were relentless, as if toying with humanity's desperation. She was buying them time. That was all she could do now. Her fighter swerved violently to the right, narrowly avoiding a hail of laser fire from a nearby cruiser. She could see the Hivarian ship's weapons charging up again. The next volley would be fatal if she didn't act fast. With a growl, Kara twisted the ship into a steep dive, evading the deadly beams just as they erupted from the enemy vessel. "Come, on," she muttered, sweat beading on her brow. Her hands moved with practiced precision, her mind racing to calculate the perfect angle of attack. She needed to be unpredictable, to throw the Hivarians off course. But as she pulled up from her dive, her sensors pinged a new signature. A fresh wave of Hivarian ships appeared, reinforcing the already overwhelming fleet. The air felt colder as Kara's mind processed the horrifying reality. They were completely outgunned. The incoming reinforcements would crush any hope they had left if they didn't act now. "We can't hold them off forever," Markov shouted over the comms, his frustration seeping through the static. "You need to fall back. The weapon is primed, it's ready." Kara's stomach twisted. She'd known this moment would come, the point where the line between life and death blurred beyond recognition. The weapon was humanity's final, desperate measure, a relic from an ancient race they didn't understand. The energy it would unleash could annihilate the entire Hivarian fleet, but it could also wipe out everything on the planet, including the last survivors of humanity. It was a gamble. The stakes were astronomical, but it was the only gamble they had left. She hit the comms button, her voice grim. "Markov, tell me when it's ready. I'm keeping them busy until you do." Kara's ship veered sharply again, this time into a vertical climb, pushing the fighter to its limits. Her chest tightened as she barely managed to outmaneuver another deadly volley, the ship's shields flaring under the impact. She fired back, sending a few desperate shots toward the nearest Hivarian cruiser, but they were ineffective. Just a futile gesture in the face of an overwhelming enemy. Her thoughts began to race. How long did they have? How much longer could the colony withstand this kind of assault? Every minute felt like a year. Then the voice of Markov crackled through, her earpiece once more, steady but tinged with a sense of finality. "We're in position. The weapon is ready." The words hit Kara like a punch to the gut. This was it. There was no turning back now. She glanced at the console, her eyes flicking from one blinking light to the next. The experimental weapon was primed, but it still required a final manual activation to release its devastating pulse of energy. Kara wasn't sure what would happen once she triggered it. Would it destroy only the Hivarians? Would it decimate everything in its path, including the colony? No one knew for certain, but she didn't have time for doubt. Kara's fingers hovered over the activate, the air thick with tension. Every part of her screamed for her to hesitate, to reconsider the cost of this decision. But deep down, she knew there was no alternative. She pressed the button. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the entire cockpit lit up with an overwhelming surge of power, the systems screaming in protest as the weapon activated. The world outside the ship seemed to warp, and Kara's heart stopped as she felt the pull of something immense, something beyond the scope of human understanding. The weapon's energy pulse shot out from the heart of the colony, a blinding beam of light that tore through the atmosphere, vaporizing everything in its path. Kara's fighter shook violently, as if the force of the weapon itself was trying to tear the ship apart. She gritted her teeth and held onto the controls, determined not to lose her grip now. The pulse collided with the Hivarian fleet. The first wave of ships vanished in an instant, disintegrated in the blinding flash. The second wave fared no better, their hulking forms reduced to mere remnants of debris, scattered and shattered by the power of the weapon. But the weapon didn't stop there. The pulse kept expanding, spreading outward, an unstoppable force of energy that ripped through the fabric of reality itself. Kara could see it, feel it, in the way the world around her seemed to bend and twist, as if the very atmosphere had been unraveled. The distant stars dimmed as the pulse expanded outward, tearing across the galaxy, its shockwave traveling faster than the speed of light. And then, everything went silent. The comms crackled, but it was only static. The screens in Kara's cockpit flickered erratically. The entire system was overloaded by the sheer force of the weapon, but then, slowly, the static cleared, and Markov's voice came through, faint but unmistakable. "We did it," he said, the words thick with disbelief. "It's over." Kara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She was alive. Humanity was alive. The colony was still standing. The weapon had worked, but at what cost? The Hivarian fleet, once a towering threat, was now nothing, more than cosmic dust scattered across the void. But the pulse had not stopped at the fleet. It had reached farther, too far, and Kara couldn't help but wonder if the same destructive energy that had eradicated the aliens might have caused irreparable damage to the planet as well. Kara opened her comms, her voice steady despite the churning fear in her chest. "Report status on the colony." There was a long pause before Markov responded, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "The colony is still intact, but we're picking up seismic readings that—" His voice faltered. "We're not sure what happened. The weapon, it didn't just hit the fleet." Kara's heart sank as she gazed out the cockpit window at the smouldering remnants of the battlefield. The pulse had gone beyond their control, and she had no way of knowing what the aftermath would bring. The Hivarians were gone, but what of humanity? Kara wiped the sweat from her brow, feeling the weight of the decision she had made. They had won, but at a cost that was still unfolding before them. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The weapon's blast had saved humanity, but at what cost? The full impact of what had just happened would unfold in the hours, days, and weeks to come. As Kara turned her fighter toward the colony, the echoes of destruction lingered in her mind. She had saved them, but humanity's future, it seemed, was just as uncertain as it had ever been. The dust still hung in the air, thick and choking, as the last remnants of the Hivarian fleet scattered across the heavens. The pulse of the weapon had torn through the sky, reducing the invaders to nothing more than ashes, but the world Kara Easton had fought to protect felt somehow more fragile than ever. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of burning metal, the remnants of the colony's defenses smouldering on the surface. She hovered above it all, her fighter slowly descending toward the wreckage that was once a thriving home for humanity's final survivors. Kara's hands still gripped the controls, her knuckles white, but her mind felt distant, overwhelmed by the weight of what had just transpired. "Status report, Markov," she said, her voice hoarse, though she fought to keep it steady. The comms crackled for a moment before Markov's voice came through, strained but clear. "The pulse hit everything, Kara. The fleet's gone, but—" His voice faltered, and she could hear the tremor of uncertainty in it. The pulse didn't just stop at the Hivarians. The ground, the colony. He sighed. The sound filled with a deep, aching exhaustion. "The weapon did more damage than we thought. The infrastructure's unstable. We've got structural collapses in several sectors. It's bad." Kara felt the weight of his words settle on her shoulders. The weapon, humanity's last hope, had not only eradicated the Hivarians, but had ravaged the planet itself. It was not just a victory, it was a Pyrrhic one. "Can we fix it?" Kara asked, though deep down she already knew the answer. They could repair the colony, rebuild it to some extent, but the scars would remain. The land would bear the mark of their final act. Their salvation had come at the cost of the very place they had tried so hard to preserve. "Not without help," Markov replied, his voice strained. "We'll need reinforcements, more resources than we can gather on our own. And even then, we don't know how long this planet will hold up. The pulse wasn't just a weapon. It changed things, Kara. We might not even fully understand what it did." Kara closed her eyes for a moment, taking in the weight of it all. She had made the choice to fight. She had made the choice to destroy. But now, the consequences were laid bare before her. The survival of humanity had cost the very foundation of their future. Still, they had survived. She had saved them, and she would not allow that victory to slip into the void without meaning. The fighter's engines whined as it touched down on the colony's outskirts, the landing gear scraping against the cracked ground. Kara took a steadying breath, pushing aside the wave of fatigue threatening to drown her. She was the captain, and it was her duty to lead no matter what the future held. She climbed out of the cockpit, her boots sinking slightly into the ash-covered ground as she made her way toward the central command. The sounds of scrambling techs, the quiet murmur of her officers trying to piece together what was left of their broken world, filled the air. Some of them moved with purpose, trying to salvage what they could from the wreckage. Others stood, still, their eyes haunted by the violence they had just witnessed, but all of them, every single one of them, was still here, alive. Kara took a moment to breathe in the cold air, the stench of burning metal and ozone sharp in her nostrils. She had led her people to this moment, and they had lived. But there was no time for celebration, no time for mourning just yet. The war was over, but the battle to survive in the aftermath had just begun. She stepped into the command center, where Markov and several other officers were already at their stations, analyzing data from the weapon's blast, trying to assess the damage. As Kara entered, they all turned toward her, their faces worn with the weight of their collective responsibility. "We've got work to do," Kara said, her voice steady. "We rebuild. We make sure we're ready for whatever comes next. This isn't the end." "Not yet." Markov nodded, though his expression was grim. "We'll need a lot of help, Kara. The colony is barely functional. If we can't get outside assistance soon, we'll be stuck here, alone. Again." Kara didn't respond. At first, she looked out over the desolate landscape, the ruins of their once thriving settlement now smoldering in the distance. Humanity had won the day, but the price was staggering. But they had won, and that meant something. "I know," she said finally, "and we'll get that help. We'll find a way." Kara turned back toward Markov, her face set in determination. "We've faced the worst. Now we endure." Over the next few weeks, the colony's survivors rallied together, their resilience a testament to the strength of humanity. With what little resources they had left, they began the difficult task of rebuilding, of finding what remained and using it to build a future. The weapon's impact had left the planet scarred, but not beyond recovery. The pulse had altered. The atmosphere weakened the land, but the colony had survived, and so had humanity. Kara worked tirelessly alongside Markov and the rest of her crew, organizing supply runs, patching up critical systems, and coordinating efforts to stabilize what remained. Though the challenges were immense, they were not without hope. There was a future to fight for, and they would not let the past define them. As the days passed, Kara found herself standing before the shattered remnants of the Central Command building, staring out over the horizon where the sun hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the ruins. It was quiet now. The storm had passed, and the stillness of the aftermath settled over the land. But beneath that stillness, something burned in Kara's chest. The future, though uncertain, was theirs to shape. It would not be easy. There would be more battles, more sacrifices, but for the first time since the fall of Earth, Kara felt the faintest glimmer of hope. "We'll rebuild," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible in the vast emptiness. One step at a time, the Hyvarians were gone, and humanity's last colony still stood, though broken and scarred. They had fought back an alien force that sought to wipe them from existence, but the cost of that victory was steep. The weapon they had unleashed had spared them, but at a terrible price. In the days and weeks that followed, Kara Easton and her team rebuilt what they could. They didn't have all the answers, but they had survived, and survival in the end was all that mattered. The last survivors of humanity stood, bloodied but unbowed. And now, as they gathered the broken pieces of their civilization, they would look to the stars and wonder what came next, because humanity's journey, after all, was far from over. The weapon had saved them, but it had also opened the door to an uncertain future, one where humanity would have to confront the consequences of its actions. There would be no easy answers, no guarantees. But there would be one truth that could never be denied. Humanity had survived, and in that survival there was a glimmer of something more, something worth fighting for. The next chapter was waiting to be written, and this time humanity would write it. Together. The winds of Asharian howled across the barren plains, the desolate landscape punctuated only by the ruins of what had once been a thriving colony. The pulse of the weapon had left scars on the planet, and though humanity had survived, the planet would never be the same. The battle for survival had been won, but the war for humanity's future had only just begun. Captain Kara Easton stood at the edge of the colony's remnants, her boots sinking slightly into the ash-covered ground as she gazed out across the horizon. The air was thick with the scent of charred metal and smouldering wreckage. The last Hivarian fleet was nothing more than space debris scattered across the void, their once immense power reduced to dust. Kara had never imagined that survival would come at such a cost. But there was no time for reflection, no room for mourning. The work of rebuilding was endless, and the reality of their fragile existence on Asharian weighed heavily on her shoulders. They were survivors, but they had no illusions about the future. Behind her, the colony's survivors moved, with quiet determination. Markov and the rest of the team were already organizing the first phases of recovery, assessing the planet's long-term viability. The damage from the weapon's pulse had been far-reaching, and even the once reliable resources of the colony were now unreliable. But humanity had always been adaptable, and Kara knew that it would be no different now. As she stood in the shadow of the Central Command building, the cold wind whipping around her, a low hum broke the silence. Kara turned, her eyes narrowing as a new shape appeared on the horizon. It was a distant glimmer at first, barely perceptible, but it grew steadily, a ship breaking through the atmosphere, cutting through the haze of smoke that hung in the air. "Markov," Kara said softly, the unease creeping into her voice. "What is that?" Markov, standing just a few paces behind her, squinted into the distance, his face hardening as he recognized the shape of the approaching vessel. "It's not one of ours," he muttered. "It's not a Hivarian ship either." Kara's mind raced. Their colony was a shadow of what it once was, and any visitor from the stars could either be salvation or doom. The fate of humanity, once, again, hung in the balance. The ship drew closer, its sleek silhouette now clear against the dimming sky. Kara felt her heart beat faster as she stepped forward, her hand instinctively resting on the weapon at her side. There was no telling who or what this was. But one thing was certain: humanity's struggle for survival had drawn attention, and now they would face whatever came next. The ship's descent slowed, hovering just above the ground as it prepared to land. Kara stood tall, her gaze unwavering, her mind calculating what steps to take next. Whatever came from this unknown ship, Kara was ready. Humanity had survived the Hivarian threat, but the universe was vast, and it was only a matter of time before humanity's actions caught the eye of something or someone else. And this time, Kara vowed, they would be ready. As the ship's engines powered down and the air grew still, Kara took a steadying breath. The next chapter was about to begin, and she would write it herself, with humanity's survival and future in mind. They had won once, against all odds, but now the real test of their strength would begin. The battle was far from over.